All right, welcome back to the new FITSNews studios for another edition of Your Week in Review. I'm Will Folks, the founding editor of FITSNews.com. Thanks for being here. We've got a ton to cover. We're going to dive right into it. First, a big update on the Murdaugh murders, crime, and corruption saga. A huge hearing down in the low country of South Carolina. Multiple defendants in the queue. We're going to walk you through everything that happened at that hearing and also give you an update on the latest documentary news related to the television aspect of that saga. Again, an international audience once again about to focus on this story. We're going to walk you through all that. Also, a major update in the Rose Petal murder. If you follow our FITSNews, Fitz Files podcast, you'll know all about this story, but there were arrests made this week in connection with that still unfolding murder mystery that we believe provides some real insight on where this case could be going. Last but not least, injustice in South Carolina. It is an epidemic. It is a cancer. And I'm going to tell you this week who the cancer is and how we need to cut it out. All of that and more coming your way on the Week in Review. It's the story America just can't quit, and apparently the story that our news outlet just can't quit. The Murdaugh murders, crime, and corruption saga. A couple weeks ago, said we had a little fatigue with this story. It then proceeded to explode across the national consciousness once again. Last week's big news, obviously the bombshell announcement of a request for a new trial by Alec Murdaugh's attorneys Dick Harpootlian and Jim Griffin. The repercussions of that filing still reverberating across the Palmetto political landscape. We've got a ton of Murdaugh news to cover in this episode, but before we get there, this drama unfolding not only in the courtrooms, but also on televisions, tablets, smartphones across the country through a number of streaming documentaries, docudramas, a Lifetime movie now. But the big enchilada of those Murdaugh cinematic offerings, the big Netflix documentary. Now, the first installment of this series dropped during the double homicide trial in Walterboro, South Carolina, back in February of 2022. Bringing this case to an international audience. The second edition, folks, of the Netflix documentary is set to drop this month, and there are a ton of names appearing in this production. We've got Attorney General Alan Wilson will be featured. Lead prosecutor Creighton Waters will also make an appearance. We've got Clerk of Court Becky Hill, who is, again, at the center of the jury tampering allegations. She is featured in that documentary. And, of course, the witness everyone wanted to hear from, who didn't take the stand at Murdaugh's trial, Curtis Eddie Smith, with some extensive interviews talking about a story that you wouldn't believe even if you'd lived it. So without further ado, we've got the trailer from that second installment of the Murdaugh Murders, A Southern Scandal Netflix documentary. Let's take a look at that trailer.
Alex called me. She said, "Can you run over this way a minute?" I said, "Man, what for?" He said, "Things just got all up." Just like that.
Paul's brain has been blown out of his body. Maggie has been shot multiple times.
It opened up a whole Pandora's box of questions.
Folks are going to have their own opinion. Mine is not an opinion. I lived it. I was there.
This case is about the digital footprint that we all have.
Thank y'all so much.
Well, then what is it?
The rumor mill in Hampton County is that it involved cartels.
He had drugs all over the place.
Miss Maggie was a scared person. She had to have been called down there for a reason.
There's another person, and maybe even more.
There was the Cousin Eddie theory.
May have had a motive to kill the family.
What happened?
There was absolutely nobody who told them what was happening, that they wouldn't have locked me up in the insane asylum.
She said if something happens to Randolph, Alec's gonna lose it.
His story kept changing.
He says he wasn't there, and we know he was there.
So does that mean that I am a suspect?
He said, I got a bad feeling. I got a bad feeling.
He was not there 30 to 40 minutes.
I just didn't want Mr. Alec's face to be the last thing that Paul saw.
I've worked a lot of bad stuff. I've never seen it done that way.
I've never felt more pressure in my life to get a case right.
I think he blames us all for his downfall.
All right, so coming out of that trailer, I'm joined now by Jen Wood, our research director, Dylan Nolan, our director of special projects. You guys, kick-ass journalists on this story from the beginning. But as we're now starting to see it sort of come together. Looking at that documentary trailer, Jen, let's start with you. Who are you most looking forward to hearing from in that second Netflix chapter?
You know what my answer is going to be. It's Cousin Eddie. I have got to hear what that man has to say. I'm shocked. I'm shocked that they got him on camera, and happy. And I related to the one quote he said when he said, "If I told everybody what I know, I would be put in an insane asylum," because since I started working on the story, I've started so many sentences with, "I know this sounds crazy, but hear me out."
Yeah. I think your line from this week was, "I'm going to need y'all to stop for 5 minutes."
Please.
Trying to get everything pulled together mentally. It's just story like no other. Dylan, let me ask you, same question. Who are you looking forward to hearing from on the Netflix doc?
Well, much like I really wanted to go back and rewatch the interview that we taped with Becky Hill after these allegations came out last week, I can't wait to see, because Netflix filmed with her prior to these allegations. Obviously, if this show is releasing, about a week from now, they had to have this taped well in advance. So I think it's going to be one of these situations where we look back with a different context, and it's going to be very interesting to hear what she has to say. Who are you looking forward to hearing from?
God, so many. I'm going to actually throw Alan Wilson's name out there. Heard, obviously positive feedback on his performance in the Fox Nation documentary, but very interested in seeing what he's got to say. Obviously, the Attorney General played a very active role in this case, and he is now very much on the hot seat as it relates to the motion that was filed by Dick Arpulin and Jim Griffin last week, demanding a new trial. Obviously, this was filmed before all that, but I'm interested in seeing what the AG's got to say. But speaking of him, let's go through what happened in Beaufort County this week. This is really the big news on the Murdaugh front this week. Last week, obviously, we were all focused on the big appeal, on the request for a new trial, on the allegations of jury tampering. But this week, we got back to basics, the nuts and bolts of the financial crimes case in particular. And Jen, let's start with you. You were live feeding, live updating all of this as it was happening in real time. Dylan, you were down there doing the live stream down in Beaufort. Great job, both of you. But Jen, let me start with you. Walk us through, first and foremost, let's focus on Corey Fleming. Walk us through what happened to Corey Fleming in court this week.
So it was Corey Fleming's big day to face the music. He pled guilty in August in relating to his state charges for the financial crimes. And this was his sentencing day. So it was interesting. I mean, I guess I always forget when we go into the sentencing phase of a case how difficult it is to watch, both, from the victim's perspective and from the family of, the person being sentenced. So I found that interesting. And, they started out, Creighton Waters detailed the charges against Corey Fleming, and there's a lot of charges. If you added up the total possible time he could have been sentenced to, it could have been 195 years. If you put all of the charges together and the maximum possible sentence for each of those charges. So he went into that trial knowing very well he could be walking into prison for the rest of his life. And Creighton said that given the gravity of his charges, he wanted to go through them. And he was on fire yesterday. He was giving me John Metters vibes when he did the closing statement, just talking about, how Corey Fleming was a lawyer. He was in a position of trust and he violated that trust. He committed crimes. He knew what he was doing was illegal, unethical. And I thought, he made a very passionate argument before turning the floor over to Corey Fleming's attorney, Deborah Barbier, who, can we just talk about how wonderful it is to see a strong female attorney finally in one of these cases? I was very impressed with her yesterday. She's a very victims focused attorney. She's her presence was appropriate, her tone was respectful, and she was advocating for Corey advocating for him in his sentence.
Well, let's just say forget the fact she's a female. Let's just focus on the fact here's one of the most competent, client focused, not tackling every media camera in the immediate vicinity, focused very solely on the client and giving great advice. I think she advised Corey Fleming from the beginning to get in front of this thing, arguing that would be in his best interest. And Dylan, you've been to several Corey Fleming hearings, state, federal, in Kingstree, down in Charleston, and then in Beaufort. Give us some of your impressions on what you saw from Corey Fleming at this sentencing hearing in Beaufort.
It's interesting, we talk about how Ms. Barbier takes a different tack than most of the attorneys, and I think one of the big reasons she does is because her client is taking a different tack than anybody else involved in the Murdaugh financial crimes, in that he's falling on the sword, he's admitting his guilt. Both Alec is fighting it and not fighting it, depending on what's convenient in what court and on what day. So you can't really say which way he's ever going. But Russell has not admitted anything. He's fighting everything. So there's a complete different tenor when you're dealing with Corey Fleming. And you saw this with how the federal prosecutors and the federal judiciary treated him. The federal prosecutors were not seeking 195 years, not at all. They could have charged him with much more serious crimes and chose not to because of his early cooperation, which, by the way, shows that this is a much more effective strategy when you're facing serious criminal prosecution than trying to fight them and making them spend hundreds of thousands of dollars because they're incentivized to then put you in jail for a very long time. But I wish that there were cameras allowed in federal courtrooms, because the tone, just the whole feeling of the whole proceedings when you were in federal court, the focus was definitely not on the victims that day. The focus was on Corey's family. And granted, the things that happened to the victims happened in the past and they're well documented. And, Corey's entered his guilty plea. So it's not like all of this stuff has to be relitigated. And when Eric Bland came up and tried to speak and tried to say many of the same things that Creighton spent 2.5 hours saying yesterday, in maybe a 10-minute little speech to the court, he was shut down about halfway through. So it was a very different approach to the proceedings, and I wish that people could have seen both to compare and contrast. But I completely understand why the state wanted to pursue charges, because just the whole mindset of how they're approaching Corey Fleming was completely different. While he did cooperate, Creighton Waters repeatedly said it's like getting busted speeding, but not wanting to admit to the fact that you're going significantly over the speed limit, but saying, yes, I was caught speeding. And I think that's a great analogy.
Yeah, he used the old doing 90, and you're trying to claim you were only doing 58. So, yeah, you were breaking the law, but it's degrees. And I think you're right. Creighton Waters did a masterful job, not only in Kingstree a few weeks ago, but in Beaufort this past week, showing that Corey Fleming was definitely doing 90. But let me ask you guys this. I spoke with Justin Bamberg a few weeks ago after that hearing in Kingstree, and he talked about how this was the most egregious lawyer misconduct in centuries in South Carolina, and that the punishments doled out in this case would set precedents. And I think that's incredibly important. But I want to ask you both now. Jen, I want to start with you. Judge Newman handed down a 20-year sentence to Corey Fleming. Do you think that sets the precedent, and do you think it's appropriate and fitting for the crimes? Jen, let's go to you first.
Yeah, I absolutely thought it was appropriate. I thought it was fitting. And I have to say that I was impressed with Corey when he spoke to the court. I felt for him. I feel he has remorse. I know a lot of people are going to say he's remorseful that he was caught, but I think he has sincere remorse for what he did to the people who trusted him as their attorney. But if you look at these two cases, the Gloria Saterfield case and her sons who trusted him, both of them are vulnerable adults. And then you look at Pamela Pinckney, who trusted Corey. Her son, who was in the accident with her, Yeah, he was deaf prior to the accident. The accident left him quadriplegic. He died. I mean, just the victim, they preyed on the most vulnerable of victims. And like, I think it was Justin Bamberg that said this, that it's the first time or it might have been Eric Blaine, I can't remember which one, but it's the first time they've seen a case of lawyers stealing from their clients in which they stole every single penny. Every penny. Which, yeah, I do. I think the sentence was absolutely appropriate. And I think Judge Newman felt the same way I did, where, you feel for Corey, you feel for his family, but it's hard to get past those facts.
Dylan?
Yeah, when I left federal court, I was left feeling like the seriousness of the crimes did not match the sentence. And one thing people say, this is nonviolent, and I agree, nonviolent crimes should not, have nearly as strong a sentence as violent crimes. But I do think that nonviolent crimes necessarily are elevated in their seriousness when the person who commits them is somebody who's put in a position of elevated trust in society, whether that be a lawyer, an accountant, somebody who's acting as a fiduciary in any capacity, because their ability to take advantage of people is so much greater. So if you're going to put yourself in a position to be bestowed with that extra level of trust from society, I think that it's only commensurate that if you abuse that trust, you should face much more serious repercussions than you or I would if we did something similar to somebody.
Absolutely. Very well said. And that's the institutional component of this. We've always said it's crime and corruption, both of them equally important. Let's pivot now, guys, if you don't mind, to the second name in the queue down in Beaufort, Russell Laffitte. Although I think we can all agree it wasn't Russell Laffitte who made news at the hearing, but rather his attorney, Todd Rutherford. And we're going to get into him later in the show. I've got some thoughts on him I'm going to share a bit later in the show. But let's talk about his appearance in court. Jen, Todd Rutherford greeting Alec Murdaugh as though he were meeting the President of the United States. What did you think when you saw that footage of Alec Murdaugh coming in and Todd Rutherford just grasping his hand and acting like old chums?
I was watching it live, and as soon as that, I immediately was like, "Ooh, that's weird. Like that is bizarre." And then as soon as I was thinking that, I started getting texts from everybody watching it live, like, "What?" It was.
Well, Dylan, you saw it. What?
I mean, I think people that follow South Carolina politics, probably most of the people, that were in the bar there, would not be surprised that this is how Todd is acting. But I really like the fact that it was broadcast live to, hundreds of thousands of people across the country, because that was I've never seen somebody show their character in that brief of a period of time before, but that is what you need to know about Todd. He's the kind of guy that goes up to somebody who's been convicted of stealing millions of dollars from people who need it more than almost anybody else in society. Somebody who's been convicted of murdering his own wife and child, and just like they're old chums. That tells you everything you need to know about Todd, but we'll get later into the show about some more substantive misdeeds. But this tells you just a quick glimpse into who Todd is as a person.
Well, and he was universally dragged on social media for it, and even Mandy Matney, give her credit, calling him out right off the bat. But a lot of folks pointing out just the tone deafness.
And I'm not saying that Alex doesn't deserve great criminal representation, but there's a way that you can conduct yourself as an attorney that you don't have to be a complete embarrassment to yourself and everybody around you, while still representing your client very well.
Well, and it ended up being sort of a less eventful hearing for Russell Laffitte, as obviously he's waiting to find out what happens federally. He's been convicted. Dylan, you covered his trial down in Charleston last November when he was convicted at the federal level. So we're obviously waiting on his appeal.
And for folks who aren't aware, there's some jury, nothing as serious as what happened in the murder trial, so it seems. Allegedly, right. We're waiting on that. But there are some other jury issues in that trial that he's waiting to have resolved, and that's what he's waiting his state case on. Now, the thing that's interesting about the legal approach that Russell Laffitte is taking is that extending and extending and extending the amount of time before he starts serving a potential sentence. And he's going to serve a sentence. Now, what sentence will it be from state, from feds? I'm not sure how that's all going to shake out. But he was offered a plea years ago. At this point, he could be pretty well into serving that bid. And instead, by the time he ends up reporting to prison, it could be that if he successfully extends this litigation for another couple of years, he could have been done with this plea if he had accepted it. So while he gets these, he's buying time, I think that's great if you're facing a murder rap, because you want to stay on the street for as long as possible because you're never coming out. But if you're facing some financial charges, I don't understand the idea of I'm going to put off going to prison for as long as possible. If I were in his shoes, I would say, kind of do what Corey did, throw myself at the feet of the court and get it over with.
And we're all in agreement that the expectation here is that Russell Laffitte likely facing a similar state term of imprisonment. Jen, is that?
I'd say similar. I mean, he's not an attorney, but he, as a banker, he had fiduciary responsibilities to the people, to the Saterfields. I would assume that will be taken into consideration as well.
Yeah. Well, some of the people at that bank look like they can't spell fiduciary. Some of the executives at that bank. We won't get into that now, but let's go to the main event from this hearing in Beaufort, the highly anticipated appearance in court of Alec Murdaugh. This was his, I believe, his first state court appearance since his trial in Colleton County. Certainly the highest profile one, coming as it did on the heels of the seismic jury tampering allegations. Alec Murdaugh walked in that courthouse like he owned it, didn't he, Dylan?
It's interesting. I actually think he looked a little less confident than I've seen him before, and I think he looked a little bit more nervous than I've seen him before. He seemed a little bit more fidgety in the chair. Of course, everybody was also noticing that he didn't walk in so much as he was walked in, because Alex was wearing a leash. So that was interesting. And there was a huge law enforcement presence at the courthouse. You could see, actually in the courtroom, you could see a lot of this, but around the whole property, it seemed like if you wanted to commit a crime in Beaufort County, yesterday was the day, because every deputy in the county seemed to be on the premise there. So it was a pretty serious proceeding.
Well, we've been covering a number of local scandals down in Beaufort on FITSNews, so it seems like there's no shortage of folks down there committing crimes, particularly of the government. But looking on this Murdaugh hearing, it was notable to me more for what didn't happen than what happened. The fact that there wasn't a direct challenge by Murdaugh's attorneys of Judge Clifton Newman. Now, they hinted at some of the potential motions to come. They talked about, during a discussion about whether or not the financial trial of Alec Murdaugh should move forward while these jury tampering allegations are being investigated. Dick Harpootlian asked Judge Newman to set his feelings aside and to rule on the merits, which was an interesting turn of a phrase there, almost as though he were setting the groundwork. But there was no motion at this point, anyway, for Judge Newman to recuse himself. Jen Wood, were you surprised by that?
Yeah, I was surprised by that. It struck me, Judge Newman typically has a very even temperament while he's presiding over something, and he seemed fed up yesterday. I thought he felt like he was kind of at the end of the rope with the Murdaugh attorneys.
Dylan, was that your sense as well, Dylan?
I don't know, fed up, but I mean, if you go to court and you see normal circuit court, the kind of antics that we saw yesterday, it's just not normal to happen in a courtroom. And I think, it must get tiring presiding over a case where this is just commonplace every time that they appear before you. It's something like this. But I do think that there's validity to the idea that he might be asked to recuse himself, and that might be a fair thing to ask, given the comments he's made in interviews after the trial, or really a single interview after the trial. I'm not sure what the president looks like there. I'm not sure what the case law looks like. We'd have to speak with some attorneys, but I can understand, at least just on its face, why that's something that they would ask.
I hear a lot of people, or a lot of chatter on social media that, if Judge Newman were to, if they considered him a material witness to this jury tampering allegations and asked him to recuse himself on that basis, well, weren't all of the attorneys involved material witnesses? And Will pointed out that but they're not required to be. They're not required to be. What's a word?
They're not sitting in judgment over the outcome of the. Yeah.
Right.
He's the only one that sits in judgment over it.
Right.
So. Well, and that was, to me, it was interesting, and I wonder. Obviously, we know Dick Harpootlian and Jim Griffin don't make one move without seeing some moves ahead on the chessboard, and I honestly was wondering whether or not this was an effort to put Newman on the record, dismissing the notion of a venue change. Not that there's been a formal motion made for that in the financial crimes yet, but certainly Judge Newman poured cold water on the suggestion that there might be a venue change, and Judge Newman also poured a bucket of cold water, ice water, on the notion that these proceedings should be delayed while the jury tampering allegations are investigated. And that, to me, was the key, because essentially the defense attorneys are asking, what's the rush? We need to get these jury tampering allegations addressed first. Newman said, absolutely not. We are moving forward with this trial. Jen, give us real quick the dates and times and locations for this next Murdaugh financial crimes trial.
So this trial that's upcoming is scheduled for November 27th, 2023, and it will be in Beaufort County again. This is for the crimes allegedly committed in the Gloria Saterfield settlement. So it's not all of his financial crimes, because those are throughout counties, Hampton, Jasper. So this is specifically for the Gloria Saterfield.
And these are the millions of dollars allegedly stolen from the insurance companies after the fall of his housekeeper there on their Moselle property. God, that Moselle property, I tell you what, if those walls could talk, we'd know a lot more about a lot of cases
right
tied to this saga. Guys, just phenomenal work this week, both of you. Dylan, your perspective being there. Jen Wood, I know you were probably having some flashbacks to the trial as you were doing the live feed there from those proceedings, but thank you for just your expertise and keeping people up to the minute on what was happening inside that Beaufort courtroom. Just great work, both of you. As we head out of this segment, obviously the state will be responding to the motion that was filed by Murdaugh's attorneys last week. Anybody got predictions for what they're going to do? Dylan, let's start with you. What do you think the state's going to say in response to the jury tampering motion?
Well, it's interesting. I don't mean to be pessimistic here for Miss Hill, Clerk Hill, but I was kind of watching all week to see, okay, is law enforcement going to do anything? Because I would think that if the state, which we know that they're in constant communication, obviously, with the state law enforcement division, they work hand in hand all the time. So, and we know the state law enforcement division is investigating this. So I've been watching all week to see if there has been any activity as far as potentially bringing people in or arresting people. We haven't seen that. It's right now as we tape this, it's almost 1 on Friday. So I'm not sure. The state might ask for more time to continue an investigation. What do you guys think is going to happen?
Jen, what do you think?
Oh boy, I really, I don't know. I expect that there's going to be an evidentiary hearing. I expect that the Court of Appeals will push it back to the trial court and say that there should be an evidentiary hearing. But I don't know that I can predict the state's response.
Mm-hmm. I mean, with these affidavits, I don't think that they can argue that there shouldn't be some sort of time in open court for these to be put on the record and discussed further.
I agree. And again, if you follow FITSNews, you know earlier this week, Jen Wood, you submitted a Freedom of Information Act request of the State Law Enforcement Division. And while this is a pending investigation, one of the things we pointed out in our coverage of that FOIA is that all of the initial inquiries were conducted in the context of the trial. Mm-hmm. That trial is a public event, a public living document, if you will. And so all of that evidence, frankly, should be available as it relates to any inquiries that were conducted by and with the court prior to March 3rd of 2023 when the trial ended. So we'll obviously keep our audience posted not only on any response we get to that FOIA, not only on any updates related to the SLED investigation, but also minute by minute, as we've said from the beginning, we were the tip of the spear on this story. As it began in the court system, we will continue to bring you the very latest on the Murdaugh saga as it makes its way through both the state and federal court systems. Thanks so much to Jen Wood and Dylan Nolan. We'll keep you in the loop on this case as it moves forward. So one of the most horrific, chaotic, confusing stories we've ever covered here at FITSNews.com is the Rose Petal murder. Now, if you've listened to our Fitz Files podcast, you know all about this story already. And if you followed our coverage on Fitz News, you probably know a little bit about it. But this is the graphic murder on the morning of October 13, 2021, of 41-year-old vet tech Christina Parcell. Parcell was stabbed more than 30 times in the head and neck area in a home owned by her sister, Tina Parcell. Her body was then dragged across that home, was placed in the front room of the residence, and dead-headed roses and rose petals sprinkled around her body at that staged crime scene, hence the name, the Rose Petal murder. We've been covering this story for months, and it has taken twists and turns that we never imagined, that I'm sure investigators and prosecutors covering or probing this murder never imagined. And then they involve not only the alleged perpetrators, but the victim as well. And I wanted to dig into that a little bit before we update you on a big development in this case that took place in Greenville County this week. But just some quick background. This murder shook the upstate as it happened in a quiet suburban neighborhood. People were scared, people were shocked. But a few weeks later, when an arrest was made, they were even more shocked because the suspect in this case, the last person you would think, a classically trained concert pianist, Zach Hughes, California native, a guy who was performing all of the sonatas of Ludwig van Beethoven. Why would this guy, with all the talent in the world, commit such a violent murder against someone he didn't even know? That is the question that we've been trying to answer from the very beginning of our investigation in this story. But it took a major step forward this past week. If you followed this story at all, you know that Zach Hughes isn't the only person who's been linked to the murder of Christina Parcell. Police and prosecutors have been focusing for months now on an individual named John Mello. Now, John Mello was the boyfriend of the victim, the father of a child with the victim, and he was instructing the murderer, Zach Hughes, to, quote, harass the shit out of the victim in the months before she died. There were also WhatsApp messages exchanged between these two the morning of the murder. Now, as we've been following this investigation, I want to be clear. Mr. Mello has not been charged in connection with the murder of his ex-girlfriend. However, if you have followed Fitz Files, you've seen a pattern of harassment that we've documented through police reports and from multiple states. Our research director, Jen Wood, did a deep dive on John Mello, found all sorts of things in his past. And not only that, Jen Wood and Callie Lyons, our researcher, have also done a deep dive on John Mello since he arrived in South Carolina several years ago, pouring through, again, a sustained campaign of harassment. But on our Fitz Files show, we exclusively reported a few weeks ago that police had linked Hughes and Mello to specific instances of harassment involving nude photos of Christina Parcell that they sent to multiple recipients, to her business, to her neighbors, places where children were able to see these photos. But it was brought out this week, for the first time, criminal charges linking Zach Hughes, the accused killer in the Rose Petal murder, with John Mello, the self-styled music producer, guy who claims he's got some organized crime connections, the guy who was engaged in this systemic harassment. But both of them charged with first-degree harassment and conspiracy regarding a campaign to send these nude photos of Christina Parcell all around Greenville back in 2021 in the months before she died. Now, Mello and Zach Hughes appeared in court together. I'm going to tell you, they were brought into the holding cell together this week in Greenville County. And I attended that hearing, and I wanted to cut real quick to a clip where the victim's sister, Tina Parcell, spoke to Zach Hughes, the accused murderer of her sister. Let's cut to that clip.
I don't know why you're doing it, but you are. You're still doing it. And this is a picture of the two of you together that was posted on Instagram in 2022. And then a week later, he posted the same picture and cut you out of it. He cut you out. I'm going to give this to your attorney. In case you'd like to see it a little more closely. Just because I feel like it's important for you to know that that's happening. I don't know that anybody's actually brought that to your attention. The images that were sent to our neighbors. Our next door neighbors that had a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old. The neighbors across the street that had a 10-year-old, a 9-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a toddler received these photos. This loving father sent pornographic images to people where any child could have gotten them. With utter disregard for any harm he was causing to the mother of his child. His own child could have found them. Her friends could have found them. And he did it anyways. Utterly callous. And based on the lack of eye contact, I would assume no regret. That's all I have. Thank you.
So I asked Tina Parcell after this hearing, what exactly was it that she handed to the attorney and that she spoke about in that clip? And here's a clip of her explaining the post that she was referring to in the hearing.
That is from John Mello's Instagram, and June 15th, 2022, he posted a photo of him, Zach Hughes, and 2 other people in Italy, and then June 27th, 2022, he posted the same photo, crouched down, just him and the woman, and completely cut Hughes out of the photo.
So now at this hearing, I obviously spoke with Hughes' attorney. He appeared, talked again about how Hughes had turned himself in when he was charged with murder, that he didn't try to jump across the border in Canada. He was apparently a stone's throw away from the Canadian border, was about to book an international flight to begin his career as a cruise ship pianist. Tragic misapplication of his abilities. We don't know exactly what was going on there. We still don't know what's going on within the mind of Zach Hughes, but I wanted to point something out. When these 2 accused criminals were brought out in Greenville County this week, they were brought out together, separated by 2 Greenville County deputies. But this was an incredibly odd moment. And I want to tell you first, I've been doing this for a long time. I've covered a lot of cases. I've sat in a courtroom, direct proximity to Alec Murdaugh for weeks on end. I'm not big on auras. I'm not big on metaphysics. I'm a black and white facts. Show me the evidence. Show me the incident reports. Show me the ballistics. Show me the forensics. Show me the autopsy results, toxicology. Just the facts. Not into the feelings and auras. But I got to tell you something. As I sat in that Greenville County detention center cell block, basically, where they bring these inmates in for these bond hearings, I could feel, and again, don't say this lightly, there was a presence in that building, a weight. Felt like you were in the presence of evil. And again, just a gut hunch. But it was also interesting, putting that aside for a minute, it was also interesting to watch the exchanges, or lack of exchanges, between these 2 individuals. As they were being brought in to be arraigned, John Mello specifically turned himself away from the television cameras. Now you think, okay, well, he's just simply don't want his face on television. I think that was only part of it. On several occasions, I watched through the grating of the cell wall there, watched John Mello attempting to make eye contact with Zach Hughes. And it was incredibly interesting to watch Hughes repeatedly ignoring the attempts of John Mello to make eye contact with him. Now again, the two never spoke to each other, never appeared to gesture to each other. Mello did try to address the charge against him, but the judge shut him down, saying, look, this is just a bond hearing. This is not the time to go through the facts of these allegations. But just some incredible tension in that room between these two individuals who everyone assumes are connected as it relates to this savage murder. Obviously, one of them already charged criminally. His DNA was found under the fingers of the victim. He's on cameras leaving the residence. He's been linked to the bicycle that was used by the killer to leave the neighborhood. So some very compelling evidence against Zach Hughes. But what is the Mello connection? Again, that has been the big mystery as the Rose Petal saga has continued to unfold. What's next in this case? Well, we do know a court hearing will be scheduled within the next few weeks in Greenville as investigators continue their efforts to extract as much information possible from the cell phone of Zach Hughes. They've got some of it. And we've also learned that in the last few days, they have been able to obtain emails from John Mello, the alleged, again, co-conspirator on these harassment and conspiracy charges, who, again, we believe is at the very least at this point a person of interest in connection with the murder investigation of Christina Parcell. But there will be a hearing on that cell phone in the next few weeks. Investigators continuing to try to get as much forensic data as possible. Remember, forensic data is so key in that Murdaugh trial, so critical to helping secure the convictions against Alec Murdaugh. Clearly, it's going to be key in the Rose Petal case as well, but count on FITSNews to continue to follow this case. And again, I want to point out, I'm going to continue not only to cover the facts of this case, but I'm going to tell you, when I see something like I saw in Greenville, when I feel something like I felt in that holding cell, again, been doing this a long time, but there was some evil in that room, folks. And again, not exactly sure where it was coming from and the origins of those bad auras, but when I feel something like that, I'm going to speak out and tell you that too, because again, I think it's important being there and seeing it and witnessing it. And count on FITSNews not only to be at any court hearings related to the Rose Petal murder, but we will be covering this trial from gavel to gavel when it starts in Greenville in the early part of 2024. So keep it tuned to FITSNews. And once again, if you haven't followed this case, be sure to go to Fitz Files on Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and get caught up on this still unsolved mystery up in Greenville, South Carolina. All right, so we talked about Todd Rutherford in our opening Murdaugh section. Of course, Todd Rutherford, one of the most powerful men in South Carolina. He is the minority leader of the South Carolina House of Representatives, where he routinely works with a Republican majority. I use air quotes there because the Republican majority, very left of center in South Carolina for 3 years in a row. In fact, they've been rated the most liberal Republican majority in the country, according to the American Conservative Union. So Todd Rutherford wields a lot of influence in that role. His party may not be in power, but more often than not, he's on the side of a lot of winning votes in that chamber. But more importantly to our discussion, Todd Rutherford is a ranking member of the Judicial Merit Selection Commission. If you don't follow South Carolina, one of only 2 states in the country that let our lawmakers pick judges, you'll know that this is the part of the process that is truly corrupt. It's a handful of lawyer legislators that literally pick who's going to be a judge, who's not going to be a judge. It is enormous influence. And Rutherford has used and abused that influence for years, getting sweetheart deals, sweetheart bonds, lenient bonds, anemic sentences at every step of the way. Well, we uncovered earlier this year a new way for Rutherford to game the system. Well, actually, we've uncovered 2 different ways he's gamed the system. First is the obliteration of mandatory minimums. We referred to that in our exclusive report documenting the illegal, unconstitutional, and extrajudicial release of gang leader, convicted killer Jared Price from the South Carolina Department of Corrections back in the spring of this year. We were the first news outlet to report on that, and that turned into a huge scandal, one in which a secret sealed file full of unsubstantiated testimony regarding Price's alleged assistance of correctional officials. Well, turns out Price failed a lie detector test. We've gotten documentation of that related to some of this alleged assistance. But whether he helped or not, the release of Jared Price from jail violated the state constitution and its victim rights conditions, and it violated the mandatory minimum law. So State Attorney General Al Wilson very aggressively took this case to the Supreme Court. They heard it, and by a 3-2 vote, they threw out Jared Price's lenient reduction of his sentence, called Todd Rutherford out. Eventually, Price was reapprehended, brought back into custody. But this is just, again, one of the ways that behind closed doors, these powerful lawyer legislators pull the strings of the judges. And in this case, some would say the prosecutor as well. Fifth Circuit Solicitor Byron Gibson. Pull their strings to get what they want done, accomplished on behalf of their clients. So that's one way they do it, by obliterating mandatory minimums. But another way they do it, and this was a new one, but we exclusively uncovered it last month. It involves controversial PSIs. Now, for those of you who don't know what that means, PSI is a pre-sentencing investigation. And it has to be approved by a solicitor and by a judge after a criminal pleads guilty. So basically, let's say I'm in court. I've been caught doing God knows what I've been caught doing. We won't get into that. But I plead guilty. Again, if the solicitor and the judge agree, they can ask the Department of Probation, Parole, and Pardon to prepare a report giving them more information about this defendant for them to consider during sentencing. Now, in this case, was this a legitimate attempt by Todd Rutherford to get a fairer sentence for his client? No. No, this was a case that the arrest was made in 2016. Robert Marks was arrested in 2016. Again, third offense, trafficking, coke, over 200 grams. This is a huge amount of drugs. And as Richland County Sheriff Leon Lott said in court during the Marks hearing this week, this is a violent drug dealer. This is an armed drug dealer. This is a major drug dealer. This is a guy that needs to be off the streets. And this is a guy who, here's that term again, mandatory minimums, was facing a mandatory minimum of 25 years. But the solicitor in the case, Byron Gibson, decided we're going to give him a much lighter charge. And oh, by the way, we're going to sign this order to have an investigation into his sentencing. Well, guess what, folks? That investigation was ordered on December 11, 2020. 33 months ago. What has Robert Marks been doing since then? Walking free. Oh, and by the way, getting arrested for arson, getting arrested for criminal and domestic violence. None of which ended up with him being remanded back into custody. Funny how that works, isn't it? Now, these charges against Robert Marks should have landed him behind bars for 25 years. But because of the reduction, he ended up getting 7 years. Again, 33 months later. Because during that period of time, prosecutors have been trying to get Todd Rutherford to appear in court, just like they tried for years to get him in court to try this case. There were 4 years that elapsed from the arrest to Robert Marks' trial, during which time Rutherford repeatedly invoked his legislative immunity, which means he doesn't have to come to court if he don't want to, because he's the powerful lawyer legislator who picks the judges. And then again, another 33 months, nearly 3 years, after his client pled guilty, just to get him in court for a sentencing hearing. 7 years. But a funny thing happened in court, and we talked about it earlier in the Murdaugh trial, because Rutherford played this card at the Murdaugh trial, but now he's playing the card in the Robert Marks trial. He accused the prosecutors of unfairly dragging his client's case out. He was indignant. And I mentioned earlier in the Murdaugh section, this guy is lucky he didn't get hit by lightning. because twice this week he blamed others for a failure that is demonstrably of his own making. And this goes again to the very heart of why this news outlet has for years pushed for reform of South Carolina's judicial selection process. Because the judge in the Robert Marks case not only did he not call Todd Rutherford out, by the way, Todd Rutherford 2.5 hours late for this hearing. This hearing was scheduled at 2 o'clock this week, this Wednesday, in Columbia, South Carolina. Todd Rutherford showed up 2.5 hours late. Not a word from the judge about the contempt he showed to the court. Not a word, let alone an actual contempt citation. But he waltzes in and then has the audacity to blame the prosecutors for delaying justice. No, it's you, Representative Rutherford. It's you who dragged this case out, refused to appear. You're the problem, not the prosecutors in this case. The prosecutor in this case, Melanie Darko, for the Fifth Circuit, is actually one of the few that's trying to get your butt in court, holding you accountable, not bowing to you. It's not her fault at all. It is your fault, Representative Rutherford. But unfortunately, the judge in this case bought it hook, line, and sinker. So a guy who should be in jail for 25 years on a third offense for major trafficking is instead 7 years, probably be out in 3.5. And we wonder, how does a guy like Rutherford get mixed up with clients like this? What's the motivation? Well, as we reported exclusively at FITSNews not long ago, Rutherford is at the heart, right now, of a federal investigation. One with state assets also involving, we're told, his, quote, official duties. Now, again, does it have anything to do with this case, other cases? We don't know. He ought to be under investigation for the illegal and unconstitutional tactics he pulled in the Jared Price case. I'm not accusing him of any illegality in this case, but this guy is a cancer on the system, people. If you want to know why South Carolina, and particularly Richland County, is increasingly unsafe, increasingly violent, where people's personal liberties, property rights are being thrown out the window, it is the influence of people like Todd Rutherford and, more importantly, the failure of our system to correct them. The failure of our system to insist on judges who are truly impartial. And yes, in many cases, it is the failure of prosecutors to insist on the toughest possible sentences for the toughest possible charges. And in this case, every single part of the Robert Marks case is failure, failure, failure. Failure on the office of Byron Gibson to bring the right charge and to insist on the proper charge. Failure on the part of former Judge DeAndrea Benjamin when she allowed this ridiculous PSI to move forward. Failure on the part, most importantly, of all the judges involved and of Todd Rutherford, the man who pulls their strings. I've said it once, I've said it a million times. South Carolina will never, ever be able to claim that it backs victims, that it supports public safety. It will never be able to claim that its system is fair until we cut out this cancer. All right, so that's a wrap for this edition of the Week in Review. Thank you for joining in. Obviously, a huge week this past week, but more coming. We're going to be looking next week for the latest developments in that chess match in the Murdaugh murder saga between defense attorneys and prosecutors as that story continues to unfold. Also, if you recall, months ago, we did a story on the family of Stan Kaiser, a victim of a horrific boating under the influence accident on Lake Murray several years ago. Kaiser's family sat down with us and spoke with us, his daughter, Morgan Kaiser. We've got an update on that case coming next week, one involving some serious allegations of impropriety in the court as it relates to the boating under the influence trial of the man responsible for the death of Stan Kaiser. We're going to bring you all that next week. Until then, thanks for joining us. We will catch you next time on the Week in Review.